Hello, welcome to Sophie & Co. Me, Sophie Shevardnadze. As the government forces in Ukraine step up their assault in the east of the country, Russia and NATO forces are conducting war games aimed at each other in the Baltics. With tension rising, could the conflict in Ukraine spill over? War correspondent and author John Pilger is my guest today.
War is ravaging Ukraine. Cities are shelled and bombed, with citizens fleeing. As Kiev gets more US cash to spend on weapons, is the West fanning the flames of conflict? Can the slow drag into a global showdown over Ukraine be stopped? And who has the power to do it?
John Pilger, veteran journalist, war correspondent, author, director, welcome. It's really great to have you on our show today. Now, we're just going to go ahead and start with Ukraine. Not a week goes by without journalists detained and assaulted in Ukraine. So why aren't we hearing any condemnation of this incident from the West?
I think in your part of the world, you must be used to a pretty one-sided view coming from here. Over here in the West, we don't believe we're biased at all. In fact, we believe we're the essence of objectivity and impartiality. But of course, when it comes to great power politics, that simply is not true. Ukraine has been presented here generally as an act of Russian manipulation and aggression. There has been some better reporting than that, but that generally is the view.
Do you think we're getting reliable information from the conflict zone in Ukraine? I mean, apart from the Western media, the world media is involved in covering this conflict. You worked as a war reporter in Africa. Is there such thing as one truth?
No, it's impossible to get an informed coverage of pretty well anywhere in the world unless you navigate your way through these days through the internet. If you don't navigate and you sit in front of your television set, then you're likely to be given propaganda. It's always been that way. It's probably now more intense, but we do have alternatives. Now, we do have the internet, but as I say, it requires that research. Otherwise, we sit in front of the TV or we pick up a newspaper and we're not so much informed as we're monitoring it or deconstructing it. That's what I do as a journalist. We live in an age of intense propaganda.
You have also said that the United States is threatening to take the world to war over Ukraine. But there's already a civil war going on in Ukraine. Do you think it could get any more serious?
Yeah. Well, we've just seen recently these nuclear strategic bombers arriving here at an Air Force base from the United States. I mean, there was a lot of news about that, and that's clearly a statement that, it's used to be called saber rattling. We used to have it year after year during the Cold War, and yes, a civil war has been triggered in Ukraine. And that civil war could spill over into Russia. Those are the real problems. But behind this is an old American design, and that is the control of resources and trade and strategic areas right across the European and Asian landmass. That's no secret. That has been going on pretty well since the United States discovered itself as a great world power around about the time of the Korean War.
Now, President Obama has approved $23 million worth of military aid to Ukraine since March. He's recently announced the U.S. is sending advisors and gear to the country, while the newly elected president, Ukrainian president, wants more military aid from the United States. What more can he expect?
Well, what you can, I mean, it's all aggressive provocation. It seems almost incredulous that they should be doing this. to be on Russia's border and provoking in the way they're doing. It's almost as if NATO, Obama, and the rest are trying to set a trap for Vladimir Putin. It's an incredibly difficult time for Russia. These are, as we all know, we're about to celebrate, we're about to commemorate the centenary of the First World War. That began, yes, partly by design, but it also was triggered by a number of incidents. And any war can happen that way. That's my experience as a war correspondent. Although there may be a policy, a design, an aim, a strategy, but there can be incidents that can start the war without people wanting it to start.
You know, since March, there's always also have been reports that the U.S. mercenaries are involved in operations in eastern Ukraine. Are you inclined to think that's true?
Well, I have no evidence of that, but I would think it's almost certainly true. Ukraine has become a kind of awful theme park for those agencies whose we know so well, CIA, FBI, the head of the director of the CIA has dropped in along with Vice President Biden. And the mercenaries, the successors of the infamous Blackwater organization, are said to be there. As I say, I don't know, I don't have evidence that they are. But this is an extraordinarily important operation, and I repeat, operation for the United States. They finally gained access to the buffer state, to Ukraine. That almost the last hurdle, if you like, before Russia.
So you are saying that Washington had foreseen a military standoff when it was supporting the opposition on Maidan. It was something that was planned, in your opinion?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course it was planned. We have the tapes of Victoria Nuland, who's boasting of the United States spending several $1 billion to get rid of the regime that it didn't like in Kiev and install another regime. This is a US-installed regime.
You're also written that actually Washington had plans to seize Russia's naval base in Crimea, and the plans have failed. Why do you think so? Do you have evidence of that? Why do you think so?
Well, you know, what is there in Ukraine for the US? Well, there is, above all, there is strategic position. There is a toehold, more than a toehold, in a part of the world where it's only recently, relatively recently, been able to gain access. And the most important prize in that was undoubtedly Crimea. This was the home of the Russian fleet. This was Russia's access. This is where we now see US troops, US ships exercising within sight of the Russian base. I think it was, I think certainly getting hold of that would have been, if the Kiev regime had got hold of it, that would have meant the United States would have got hold of it. I don't think there's any question about that. It was all part of, as I've said, a provocation. That it's a very intriguing mix, all the reasons why the United States has behaved the way it has in Ukraine. Partly it is about strategic influence, partly it is about business, partly it is about provocation. They're all different ingredients. This administration in Washington has been doing some very strange things. It also may have been, and I'm only guessing here, an attempt to the Obama administration to reassert itself, having really been trumped by Russia over Syria.
We're going to get to that in our second part of the show, but first we're going to take a short break. When we're back, we're going to continue talking to John Pilger, veteran journalist and author. We'll talk more about the impact and the extent of American global ambitions. Stay with us.
Divisions within Ukraine are becoming greater with each passing day. The Western-backed regime in Kiev shows no interest in compromise or negotiations. At the same time, civilians in the east continue to die. Kiev is going for broke.
Right from the scene. First-rate news and eye-gripping pictures. On our reporters' Twitter and Instagram. To be in the know, follow us online.
Eugenics? What's eugenics?
Vulgarization of Darwin's science. Punishment for an uncommitted crime.
I was sterilized for being innately feeble-minded. Still today, I don't know why. I still don't know why.
Genetic improvement through forced sterilization. The basis for Nazi ideology.
They don't stop at just sterilizing and now go to the point of death.
Hidden for years. Rarely discussed. Until now.
I'd really rather not talk about that right now.
We are not talking the language of war, but I will only react to situations.
I have read the reports, but I'm not in a position to...
No, I will leave that to the State Department to comment on your latter point.
I don't want to say that.
Mr. Kerry, do you have any comments on the document? No comment? Thank you.
No more weasel words. When you evade a direct question, be prepared for a chase. When you throw a punch, be ready for a battle.
Freedom of speech means little without the freedom to question.
And we're back with John Pilger, war correspondent and author. So you also said that Obama is currently seeking a budget for nuclear weapons greater than during the Cold War. Where are you getting this information for?
Yeah.
And also, what would he need it for?
You just look it up. It's all there. There's no secret. The rise in the manufacture of warheads and of nuclear strategic materials has been steadily increasing over recent years. But in many ways, that's whether or not it is academic, because the United States has many, many nuclear warheads, just as Russia still has nuclear warheads. That means when the so-called superpower and a regional power like Russia find themselves looking down each other's gun barrels, and that's a situation that we've got at the moment.
So you think
when there is...
So you think Obama is reinforcing its nuclear budget to confront Russia? Is that it? Do you think there is a chance of a nuclear conflict?
Please.
So you think Obama is reinforcing his nuclear budget?
There's always a chance. You know that the nuclear clock has been at 5 minutes to midnight for many years now. There has always been a chance of nuclear war. There always will be while there is this kind of dangerous situation. I'm of course not going to predict there will or won't be one, but the dangers are obvious. You only have to look or read what General Butler, the former head of the US Strategic Air Command, he said, and I paraphrase him, he said the dangers are there every day. But when you have a flashpoint with two nuclear powers engaged, even indirectly engaged, and they're not directly engaged at the moment, but they're indirectly engaged, that's extremely dangerous.
But remember when there was a lot of talk whether America should strike locally Syria with local strikes, the prospect of action in Syria got a very cold response from both the Congress and the public. So what makes you think that, you know, Americans are as gung-ho over Ukraine as the military brass?
Well, I didn't quite hear the beginning of that question, but I heard the last bit. It's very simple. American foreign policy is run pretty well in a straight line since about 1950. And you only have to consult the documentary record to see, to answer that question. There is always a danger, but something else has happened recently, certainly since certainly during the Bush years. The military, the Pentagon in the United States, now is in the ascendancy. It has much greater power than it used to have. It has influence in the State Department. It has influence right throughout all the institutions of government in Washington. There is a military sense all the time about American foreign policy at a higher level than they used to be.
Right, but
the idea of diplomacy.
The first part of my question, which you didn't hear, was precisely about the American foreign policy that failed in terms of striking Syria. Because remember when there was talk about whether America would bomb Syria or not, it didn't get any support from Congress or the general public.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is in many ways, this is an administration that contradicts itself, which makes it even more dangerous. Syria was, it seemed to be, almost the design of the intelligence agencies in the United States, the support for a lot of the radical groups came from the intelligence and what is called the deep state in the United States. Whether or not the White House agreed with that, I've no idea. I mean, that is one of the great contradictions. In Washington, there's always a great deal of competition. And as a result, the White House was made to look rather foolish over Syria. It staked a lot on the allegation that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons. Well, according to Seymour Hersh, they didn't use chemical weapons. And there's not a great deal of evidence to suggest that they did use chemical weapons. There is evidence to suggest that those whom the Americans were supporting used chemical weapons. So, you know, into this contradictory and confusing and rather tumultuous situation, the almost the black and white of US foreign policy doesn't work in their own terms.
Since we started talking about Syria, the issue of Syria has been completely eclipsed by Ukraine lately. No one seems to mention it anymore. Meanwhile, American administration is still providing arms to the opposition. So could it
unless
be
you're Syrian?
Yeah, but could it be that United States is getting free rein there while Russia is busy?
Possibly. I read the other day that there is going to be non-lethal and lethal aid to some of the opponents of the jihadists opposing the Assad regime. Yes, the world looks the other way, and things happen. I think that's very possible. Where that is heading, it is almost impossible to know, because my understanding is that the United States actually would like to have a settlement with Iran. That seemed to be the way it was heading, and that would mean a kind of settlement with Syria. And then it could concentrate on what is really close to this administration's heart, and that is confronting China, and perhaps also confronting Russia. Certainly dealing with its grand design on the Eurasian continent. Now, if, for example, as I understand it, 2/3 of US naval forces are going to be transferred to the Asia-Pacific region by the year 2020, then that will mean the US will have to tidy up all these unfortunate problems that it has, Syria, Iran, and so on. You know, all I'm saying is US policy, as it's acted out in Syria, is very, very confusing, because they don't seem to be wanting to resolve matters there. They seem to want to stoke it instead of play some kind of brokerage role, calm it, and deal with it.
I want to get back a little bit to NATO and the war games that just took place in Eastern Europe, like the most recent ones in Latvia. So do you think those are aimed at intimidating Russia? Is that their sole goal?
You know, I've thought about why this intimidation of Russia is going on, and I think it is partly historical. The Soviet Union was deeply resented just for existing, because it was getting in the way of an enormous part of the world that the United States and its Western allies had previously had a great deal to do with and exploited, and wanted to do that again. And I think there is almost an historical sense of unfinished business. There is no question that US foreign policy finds its opponents or enemies in those governments that affect any form of independence. That is a rule that runs right through it. Now, the Russian government is independent. It's a very powerful and very important independent government. And there's a history between Russia and the United States. You can never underestimate this history.
Where do you think the United States, European allies' interests are in all of this, in the whole US versus China, US versus Russia? Can Europe act independently, or are they completely under US influence?
Well, that's a very good question. What are their interests? I don't know. I mean, you know, the interests of trading peacefully with Russia and with China are demonstrable. Gas from Russia and every manufactured good we can think of from China. What is the problem, you might ask? And for Europeans to go along with this kind of Wild West kind of foreign policy is absurd. But Europe is divided. Europe, in terms of foreign policy, often reluctantly, but it does it. It falls in with the United States. You only have to read the German press to see this. There's a kind of ambivalence almost. What do we do? Oh, well, we better go with the US. Europe has never spoken with one voice that has been entirely representative or reflecting its own interests.
All right, Mr. Pilger, thank you so much for this interesting interview. We're talking to John Pilger, author, journalist, war correspondent. We're talking about America's interests in the Ukraine and also what's NATO going to do next. Thank you very much. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. And we'll see you next time.